diverse backgrounds and with the diverse life purposes that we find in current learning settings. Can you please welcome Howard Nichols?
Thank you. Thank you, and it's good to see you. I'm going to need you talking with one another, so please don't sit on your own. This is, after all, about communication. If you go back and think about what Joe was saying at the beginning today about what's involved in this process of communication and the various layers that go around that, then there's already a signal that things are complex. If we think of language as the convenient, easy assumption of the sounds we make, the talking that we do, the words that we use, the grammar and the pronunciation, that's already complex enough. But the process of communication involves much, much more than that. And what I want to do is begin with a couple of examples just to get you thinking about what we mean by communication. Now, this is one of my favourite artists. Yang Liu is a German-Chinese artist. All right? So if you think about these different ways of problem solving, now she's drawing on her own experience of being born in China, growing up in Germany, and reflecting on both a German way of doing things and a Chinese way of doing things. Now, we can also reject the stereotyping that's involved in this. We can also say that it's not as simple as that. On the other hand, we can also look at this and think, how many words do we need to capture this complexity? What does this image convey of a really complex social phenomenon, a culturally embedded social phenomenon? How much language do we need to convey this extraordinarily complex construct? At the one level, these beautifully simple pictures say no language at all. But if you have to try and negotiate these, then there's an enormous amount of language that's involved. So if you are going to in some way engage with the German norm of direct problem solving, what kind of uses of language do you need? What other resources do you need to make that approach to problem solving realistic? If you are going to approach and deal with the Chinese way of negotiating problems, what other sorts of resources do you need? And if you have both German and Chinese, what resources do you use? And how do you combine both your Chineseness and your Germanness in solving that problem? So when we look at just an image like this, we get to a much larger question of how complex and what else is involved in the process of using language. Here's another one, much more local. Topic approach. How many of you have done the life cycle of the X? Right? Most of you will at some time, I hope, either have read or have had read to you The Very Hungry Caterpillar. A 6 to 8 year old Vietnamese boy in a language centre in Melbourne was presented with the problem of how do you work from the life cycle experience to the presentation of the life cycle experience in the linear form of a big book. And when you do that translation process, the very first question that you confront is, where do you begin? As you move from the depiction of the cycle to the presentation in a book, you have to have a page one. And the class was engaged in this conversation about chicken or egg. This young boy solved that problem beautifully. He looked at the picture of the butterfly and he looked at the picture of the egg and he said, same, same. Now, we can convert that into the kind of English that Joe was saying we need to worry about to get people to have the verbal power that they need to be active members of the society. We can say, it doesn't really matter which of these two arbitrary points in the cycle you select in order to identify your first page. Or we can say, same, same. So the very concept of language is not as simple as it appears to be and connects with a whole variety of other resources. Same, same doesn't work unless you have a picture of a butterfly and a picture of an egg available to you to point at. So it's never just the words alone, it's the context and other resources that we have that help to make the various communication options more or less realistic. Here's another one. Writing. We can do a little bit of grammatical analysis, writing as verb or writing as noun. We can do it as activity analysis, writing as process or writing as product. Writing is both of those things, and they're not the same. They are connected, but they're not the same. So further, when we take this already complex notion of writing, let's have a look at what we mean by writing. When we say writing, do we mean writing by hand? Do we mean writing with a computer? Do we mean writing using digital devices but producing handwriting? Or do we mean using our fingers to produce typed text? Each of those parts of writing are same and different. So when we're teaching people the additional language and we are teaching them to write, what do we mean? And when we say your writing is excellent, do we mean this? Or do we mean that? Or do we mean this bit here? So we need to get a more complex view of what it is that we are teaching than just the term language implies. Language is significant, but it is connected with a bunch of other things. And we need to think of ways in which we can engage with that complexity in order first for ourselves to theorise a view of what we mean when we say, I'm teaching English as an additional language. What is that we are teaching? What does English mean? Okay. So, with the person next to you, or people, when we say language, what do we mean? And I'm going to get examples from you. And I'm going to chat with the people around you. When you say, I'm teaching English as an additional language, what do you mean and what do you include within your concept of language? All right. Now, at the risk of proving exactly how the worried Russell needed to be when he said, I learn more from my students than I teach them, what do we say? What do you mean? What do you include under this concept of language? Just shout out words. I'm not going to go around the room and point to every single group, but if you remain silent, I will. Okay. Yep.
Negotiation.
Oops. I'll spell too eventually. Yep.
Cultural understandings.
Macro skills.
A tool for access. Power. Verbal and non-verbal. Purpose.
Anybody want to say phonology, pronunciation?
Phonology.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Presumably also, but despite everything else I said, they are still things that we have there in some way. Yep. Anything else you want to add?
Construct.
Participation. Register. Usefulness or relevance. Community.
Okay. That's not a bad list. Again, notice the complexity of that. Notice all of the layers within all of that. When we say, just to pick on one, formal and informal, how do we recognise something as formal and informal? And if we are in an informal environment, can we say, "Hey, my name's Howard." Right? Is that informal or inappropriate? All right? So that we've got a whole bunch of things that are going on here. These are really subtle judgments that we need to make, and they do a whole lot of things. What made it inappropriate? Was it the tone of voice? Was it the leaning on the elbow? Was it the getting really close? Each of these is part of this thing that we simply call language. It's really layered, involving many, many different things. So, language, all right, now some of you have stolen a bit of my fire, but let's say you've mentioned here communication. But what do we mean by to communicate? Same activity. Okay, so what does it actually mean then to communicate? The thing that we do all the time, the thing that we say that we do, what does it mean to communicate? Yep.
A shared understanding, a sort of pathway.
Transfer the
Giving and receiving of messages. Same thing. Negotiating.
various levels of understanding.
Connection. Verbal and non-verbal.
Any of you ever been in a situation where you think, I got out of that situation really well because I didn't actually have to say anything? Is that communication? Okay. Any of you ever listened to a politician trying not to answer a question but to keep on talking? Is that communication? Any of you ever deliberately wanted to be vague? Is that communication? Any of you ever wanted to impose, persuade, make somebody do something? Go to bed now. Right? Is that communication? Okay. So equally, communication and to communicate involves a whole bunch of this, some of which is nice, but some of which is a necessary part of dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty, or racism. If somebody is racist to one of your students, what means of defence do we give them? Many years ago, I was teaching a very large man about how to behave in a pub. I was about as old as Joe was at the time. And his response was, I hit him. Okay, that's the resource that you've got, not me. Right? So how do we negotiate? What else is involved? Which of these things is desirable, which not? So like language, the very term communicate conveys and contains many, many different aspects. And if we are to teach people to use English as an additional language to communicate, we need not only to be conscious of what we mean by language, but what we are bringing into this understanding of what a communication process is going to involve. So what happens when one of our students, be they child or adult, is being prevented from doing something and they have to persist, they have to argue back, they have to assert because the office or person they are trying to get a service from is blocking them, sending them away. So it's not only the wonderful, close, empathic forms of communication that we would like to see happening everywhere. It's also the systemic discrimination and blocking that our students will also encounter as soon as they get outside our classrooms and sometimes when they're in our classrooms. We need to be conscious of all of these different layers. Okay, so then when you think about a process of communication, and this may be more useful to think about your own processes of communication, but you might also want to think about some particularly innovative students who you have had. What resources do you draw on when you communicate? What things do you use to communicate? And I'm doing some of it already, but so's this. So, what resources do you use when you communicate? Same activity. Okay, what resources do you use? Stories. Other. 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 Other.
Gestures. Empathy.
Other.
Thinking skills. Forward thinking skills. Listening. Each other. Prior knowledge. Time. Presentations. Confidence. Register.
Okay.
Willingness. Time.
Motivation.
Persistent.
Okay.
Cultural understanding.
All right. Okay, that's not a bad list. Any burning other ones you want to add? Okay. So all of those things. So if what we're doing, if language is part of communication and communication is using these resources, then in our design of our teaching programs, what do we include? And in order for this to make sense to us, how do we organise this in a way that it is manageable? If you look at what I've pushed you to do is to develop 3 long lists, each overlapping, each separate, each distinctive in some way, but as all lists are, unless they're alphabetic or numeric, disorganised. It's one thing after the other. And so we get back to this impression of what I have to do is one more thing, one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. Okay. So in the work that Donna Starks and I have been doing, what we've been trying to do is to find a way in which we can talk about these resources and these different layers of communication and language in ways that become bounded and systematic. So in ways that we can show the different connections between the different parts of what we're calling the communicative repertoire. Now, the communicative repertoire brings with it the idea that it's more than just any one thing. It's more than just language. It's all of the things that you've been talking about. Now, that's our model. Okay, so let me try and unpack that a little bit. We call it multiplicity because, as you see, it's got multiple things all together at the same time. But fundamentally, what multiplicity does is to say there are 4 broad dimensions to the communicative repertoire. Some of them you've named already. Purposes, that's the one over here. Purposes. That there is a dimension to communication which is captured in the notion of purposes. Or if you like, answers to the simple question, why and with whom am I communicating? There is a second part of that, which is varieties. We've heard Joe also this morning talking about norms, ways in which things are done, ways in which things are organised in relationship to particular frameworks, contexts. So, for example, English is related to various norms of use. We shorthand them by saying Australian English, American English, British English, the Englishes of India, etc., etc., etc. Each of those is a norm, a set of ways of putting things together. So 2 of these dimensions, purposes and varieties. Then two other dimensions that are closer to what are usually the building blocks. The first of these is modes, the physical things, the seeable, hearable, sometimes touchable resources that we use. So, for example, sound. Now, I'm using sound at the moment. I'm using sound in association with a particular variety for a particular purpose. But we also use sound in other ways as well. So in the middle of getting lost in a sentence, I can say, oh. So it's not just the words and the pronunciation patterns. It's also what you've talked about as tone, what you've talked about as pace. The speed with which we produce the sound. Now, you'll notice in here, there is no word writing, there is no word pronunciation. Sound is the resource, whether it is linguistic, as in words, or whether it is the non-linguistic aspects, such as movement. Some of the things that I am accused of doing all the time, that I cannot communicate if my hands are tied behind my back. But movement is also, if you think about, get this right, an image. Writing is an image. When we read writing, we're looking at and reading an image. It's something that we see. When we are producing writing, it's just movement. And then spatial orientation, the amount of space or the layout of things. So modes are these physical aspects. We've left a space there because we think there are probably other things. For example, touch. And that's clearly culturally bound, but touch is another resource that we use. Donna, in her more radical moments, would also argue that smell is. Certainly, if you think about ways in which you might use perfume, you can argue it has a real communicative purpose and is a real resource. Okay. Now, we do this very deliberately because we want to make a distinction between the physical, technical resources that you use and the technologies that you use to produce them. So, writing, being written by hand, is mediated. Russell's word, right? Mediated by the human body and perhaps by a pencil or a pen. So an image that is associated with movement and a human body and an analogue resource is somebody who is writing with their pen. But if that same person is writing not with a pen but with a computer, then they're using a digital mediation. So the communicative repertoire is bounded by these four dimensions. The purposes that we have, I'll get it up here. The purposes that we have, the varieties that we're drawing on, the modes that constitute it, and the mediations by which it is produced. What, how, why, with whom, and in relation to what. We do not want people to think of this as, you've got to remember what the past pluperfect was. Right? That's crazy. We're not trying to introduce a whole new language that people have to learn. What we're trying to say is we as teachers can form a view of the complexity of things that we draw on in making any single communicative act. We can lay them out here in the way that I've just done, but for our learners, we can do it in much simpler ways. Oops, I'll get this red thing going. Okay. With whom are you trying to talk and why? How do you want to come across? Do you want to talk or do you want to write? And if you want to write, do you want to write with a computer or write with a pen? So these complex constructs that are laid out here can be translated into much more traditional, transparent lay terms. The important point of thinking about this as a communicative repertoire is it doesn't matter whether you use this kind of terminology or the terminology I've just been using. What you're saying is every time you try to communicate, you are drawing on all 4 of these dimensions in some way. And every time we do that, we make choices. So our learners, every time they open their mouth or pick up a writing instrument, are making a choice. They're making a choice about what they might be, what they want to do, with whom they want to do it, and how they want to come across. They can be limited in their resources at any particular point. But exactly the point that's been a theme throughout today, these are people who know about communication, they know about choices, they are capable of making these choices. What we're doing is giving them some of the things with which to make their choices more powerful. So if I can only say, it was the same year as Joe, my first ESL class. Students walked in. Good morning, teacher. Good morning, how are you? Fine, thanks, and you? Oh, pretty good. What did you do over the weekend? Fine, thanks, and you? Limited resources, well-trained, well-used, appropriate, but constrained. They couldn't do very much with that basic communicative resource. My job? To help them expand that. My job? To enable them to be more powerful in the way they engaged with their lives, more able to take control of the interactions that they wanted to take control of or that they would be confronted with. I didn't have this available to me at the time. I had... No, we won't go back there. Okay, but we can now talk to this. So Joe's question from before, who do you want to talk to? The Housing Commission, the doctor, or what did you have for breakfast this morning? That's a purpose. A purpose will use a text of some kind. We can teach certain parts about the text of interaction. If you're going into the bureaucracy, do you need to pick up a number first? Do you need a queuing system? If you register for a conference, do you meet a person or do you press a button? We can teach about the way these institutions are organised. Okay. So, the point then is, in contrast to the lists that I was getting you to develop, what we're trying to do with this framework is to say, look at the intersections between the different dimensions and the different aspects. They all combine. So my "G'day, my name's Howard" before was a combination of a certain selection of sounds, a certain selection of movements using my body, a certain spatial orientation, again, using my body, drawing on a norm that we know about for how you meet somebody, echoing also certain other norms that we're familiar with about sleazes. And in a context, so what we then had here, the other one that I really want to focus on, otherness. Right? You hopefully realised when I was doing that I was playing a role. That in any communicative activity, most particularly in classrooms, we're working at 2 different levels at the same time. We are both inside the classroom doing things that are important for the inside classroom work and outside the classroom at the same time, thinking about what we're doing inside the classroom is going to be like outside the classroom. So in this otherness, I was born as an English speaker and I've become pretty fluent in German. When I operate in German, there is part of me that takes the Australian experience and infuses that through my Germanness. And that's a really important part of the way that I use German. It's part of me. In some cases, that's an accent. But in other cases, it's a deliberate choice about communicative behaviour. I was teaching in Germany in a university a couple of years ago. My office door was always open. That was an Australian communicative behaviour that I operated with in German. So these things, that's also an accent. That was an Australian-shaped use of a German communicative resource. Door open, people can walk in. Door shut, you knock and ask whether you've got permission. It shapes power relationships. Our learners do the same things. They are making choices. They are being more than just the one thing that becomes apparent through the English that they're using. So when we're teaching them English, we also need to be conscious of this layered nature of who they are, what we refer to as self. The self that they present, the self who they show themselves to be, has layers within it. Layers that are bound up with their history, layers that are bound up with where they have been and how they have been there, layers bound up with how they choose to wear their clothes or decorate themselves, layers with in terms of the situations that they embed themselves in. So our learners are, from this perspective, powerful from the beginning. Their power may be constrained by the institutions and the individuals with which they engage, but they have power to make choices, and therefore what we need to teach them respects their capacity to choose. My little Vietnamese boy, same. He chose a way to do something. I can give him more standard ways of doing that as well, but he was already capable of making that intellectual choice. He was able to explain to me, in his words, this complex construct. I could explain it back to him in my words, but he had this capacity to enact his self. And so the theory that we need for what we are teaching has to respect that complexity of layers and that complexity of resources that all of us, including our learners, draw on all the time when we make use of language. The way, I'm conscious of time, right? So what we think about then is the process of learning, because I said in the abstract I talk about learning, is like this inverted pyramid. The same 4 dimensions, think about those as the multiplicity is expanding over time. Within that, there are certain predictable regularities. We know something about those for grammar. We know something, a little bit, about those that for macro texts, generic features. We know very little about many of the other aspects of this rich communicative repertoire. And within that, there is enormous space for variation. Individuals will choose different pathways through this. They will make different connections. They will be different people in this process, but they will all be drawing on this same fundamental interconnection between purpose, varieties, modes, and mediations. And if we've got something like that, then what we have is a way of making long lists more manageable as ways of thinking about the interconnections between the different resources that make up the communicative repertoire that we use. And there I'd better shut up and stop.
Well, thank you very much, Howard, on behalf of VicTESOL for your incredibly engaging and thought-provoking presentation today. I was sitting here reflecting, thinking, I wish that was the first lecture that I had in my Diploma of Education in my EAL method, because I think that it would have set the tone for the past 12 years or so that I've been working with EAL students, and I think that everyone would have taken something very deep from today's presentation. So thank you again. Here's a small token of our appreciation.